So, one of the things that it's really helpful to talk about is what we call the cycles of doing and being.
Yes, so it's quite interesting in life, isn't it? I don't know if it's the way we're brought up or our education systems or expectations from outside, but quite often we can get trapped in a cycle of doing, and that can be linked to our need to perform or meet certain people's expectations. And in fact, there needs to be a balance in life, doesn't there, between being and doing. And our worth is much more rooted in being than doing. But we can get the two muddled up. So it seems to me that when you look at the cycle of doing, we can feel that we are what we achieve. Whereas when we look at the cycle of being, we say we do because we can, because we're loved, and we're valuable as we are. We don't have to do anything to actually be accepted. And yet that is the way we feel about life quite often. Sometimes the problem with the cycle of doing is that we can get stuck in a cycle. And if we don't achieve what we want to achieve, we can feel that we're not worth very much, or that might impact on how we feel we are loved or perceived by others or by God. In fact, that's not actually true. But we can fall into the trap. And it can lead to a feeling of not wanting to try if we failed. Whereas actually, if we focus again on the fact we are loved, we do nourish ourselves in God's word or be in nature or feel ourselves restored in some way by him and by others, then actually we get back into the cycle of being, which is more about doing things because they're an expression of who we are, rather than to prove something. So because we're unique, we are made as we are. That stands on its own, really, rather than having to be validated by achievements. It's not always how we feel. So there's probably a bit of learning that we need to do there, or at least there is for me. But it might be worth us thinking about what causes us to get stuck in the cycle of doing, and be interested to know any feelings that you have about that, Catherine.
That's a really interesting question. I think the cycle of doing, that cycle where you start off with thinking that you need to achieve, and then you go and you do stuff and you achieve, and then you kind of feel good about it for about 10 minutes, and then you think, oh, I'm not going to be worth anything unless I do something. So I think that's actually a cycle which is very reflective of the way that society views people. Particularly now that I don't have a job which has an easy job title, I sometimes watch somebody on like a quiz program, and they are always introduced as, well, this is Tom from Manchester and he's a GP, or this is Kirsty from Southampton and she's a chartered accountant. And you kind of think, well, I wonder what I would say, because I'm not easily labelable anymore. So there is this sense that our identity is almost hardwired to be about what we do. And if you watch Who Do You Think You Are, then they'll go back in time, won't they?
Yeah.
And it's almost like on an official document, you don't just put your name, you also put your name and then your profession.
Yes.
So if you look at your birth certificate, it will have your parents' names and their professions. Yeah. This is what you do. So it's no wonder that we sort of feel like that's going to be who we are. The other thing I think is that actually what we do is more easily measurable. You know, if you've made X number of widgets, or if you can say, well, I've got this certificate because I studied for it, or I've earned this amount of money this year, all of those things feel quite tangible.
Yes.
And they're also quite easy to show to other people. So you can think, here is this thing, and I can present it to my parents or my boss or the person next door, and I can say, well, this is me and this is what I do. Whereas actually quite often if we're in the cycle of being, it's a lot less tangible. It is more solid, so it's a much more restful place to stop the cycle of being. So in the cycle of being, you're starting from the point of believing that you are already worthwhile, that you are already precious, that you being in the world is already a good thing.
Yes.
And you don't have to do anything to prove that.
Yeah.
But then when you do stuff, it comes out of what you want to do.
Yes, absolutely. Yes. I had an interesting example at church recently. We have a new person who's joined the church, and I was standing next to a friend who introduced herself to one of the new ministers and said, "Oh, hello, I'm," let's call her Joan, and I'm involved in pastoral work. And at which point I thought, oh, that's interesting. So I just said, well, I'm Rachel and I don't have a role in the church apart from being on the prayer team, but that's fine, I'm me and I'm a Christian. And fortunately the new person picked up on that and said, well, that's great, that's fine, that's all we need to be. But it was interesting, there was an interesting moment because my friend had gone in with her official description, if you like, which had made me feel marginally vulnerable at that stage, not to go in with a role. Not that I'm particularly worried because I think my focus is elsewhere. But it was interesting. I could actually have gone into comparison at that stage and felt bad about myself. I actually laughed about it and I was pretty free. It was fine. But it was interesting. At other times I might not have felt like that. And I think it's interesting because there's many times in our life, aren't there, when we won't have a role, perhaps when we're older, or we won't have an official work role. We might be doing something incredibly important like bringing up children, which is the biggest role I can see, when I really admire people who do that. So actually it can't just be based on what we, quote, do. And I don't believe that it is.
No, and it's interesting when you're talking about the parenting thing, because what comes to mind for me is that actually as the parent of two kids with fairly significant special needs who need extra support, and who don't always present to the world in a way that the world expects. Actually, one of the challenges for me has been that not only was it not feasible to work whilst parenting, but from an outside point of view, even the parenting didn't look like it was going that well.
Yeah.
And I recently have started meeting with other parents of children with special needs in the area, and just meeting for coffee. And what's really interesting is that that's a theme which is often repeated, that what people find is that they are viewed by other people as being unsuccessful or like they're not fitting in. And then they end up feeling really quite isolated and disconnected because there's this sense of, well, if I can't identify A, that I've got a role, and B, that I'm doing all right at it, then where do I fit?
Yeah. Yeah, I've heard others in a similar situation, Catherine, in my church, describe their journey that way. And it was very lonely.
Yes.
And very hard to find people who understood, even in the church, sadly. I think they've got there in the end, but it took a long while. And there'd be lots of sort of support at the beginning when they adopted, etc. And they found it harder to have support later on, which is a little sad, actually. But when we talk about identity in relation to work, I had an interesting situation in that I was working with someone when I was a Job Plus coach in my place of work. And a person who came to me for coaching actually said to me, I've come into some money and strangely I'm not going to need to work anymore. But I've worked so hard all my life. And the question I'm bringing to coaching is, if I don't work, who am I? I think it's a tricky one because sometimes having a sense of purpose and identity does get you through things.
Yeah.
When I wasn't well, actually having that sense of purpose and identity was hugely important in helping me move forward because I felt I had stuff to do.
Yes.
So I think, we have to get the balance. But I certainly, you need to be very clear on who you are rather than who what you do. I had the same thing when I had Bell's palsy. might look very, very strange, or certainly did at the time. They just look vaguely strange now. But I did look very, very strange at the time. And that was a very interesting one for identity. Knowing that you were who you were, however strange you looked, and however strangely people looked at you. You were who you were. And that mattered. So you certainly learn those lessons at those times, I think.
I think that's true. And it's not that we don't do things, because actually that is part of who we are. It's not about not doing stuff. It's about doing things from the basis of I am already worthwhile.
Yes.
So I will do things, but they won't be driven by what I think everybody else needs and what I need in order to meet my success needs.
Yeah.
Instead of being driven, it can flow from this is who I am, and because this is who I am, this is what I want to offer to the world.
Yeah.
And if you can offer it freely, because you don't have to offer it in order to feel like you're worthwhile, then that is going to come from a much freer place. And actually what you offer to the world is going to be of a different kind.
Yes.
And you'll probably be a nicer person to be around.
Absolutely.
To be frank.
And the sense of ease will be a lot greater.
Yes. And if you're looking at the cycle of being, then what you'll notice is that actually it is the case that when you do a lot, you then have to go back to that place of resting in God and resting in who you are, that will then give you the energy again to kind of keep going. So it's not that we never get to a point of thinking,
sure,
oh gosh, am I really worth something? Am I getting things right? Am I falling off a bit? It's not that you don't ever go there.
Sure.
It's that that's not the primary way around that you go. And you know that the answer to that is not to achieve lots of things in order to get that sense of purpose and identity back. It's not that at all. It's about, okay, let me remind myself that God loves me and that who I am is worthwhile, and that really my primary calling is about being and being loved. And once I've got myself reminded of that, then I'll be good to go again.
Yes. It reminds me that someone, I'm sure I have a long way to go on this, but someone once asked me what I wanted written on my gravestone. And rather than come up with all these marvellous things, the thing that came to mind is that I wanted them to write, "She loved well."
Oh, that's beautiful.
And that's quite interesting, isn't it? I didn't know that was there until someone asked me the question. And so despite the fact I'd like to go on and achieve all sorts of marvellous things, actually that matters more.
Yeah.